The winter of 1864 arrived cold and unforgiving in Tallahassee, Florida, carrying with it the bitter winds of a war that had already consumed nearly 4 years of American blood. The Confederacy, though wounded and weakening, still clung desperately to its vision of a nation built upon the subjugation of human beings. In the grand plantation houses that dotted the landscape like monuments to cruelty, life continued with a grotesque normalcy. Balls were held, marriages arranged, fortunes counted in flesh and cotton. It was in this world of calculated inhumanity that Micah existed, a young man of perhaps 25 years, though he could not be certain of his own age. Enslaved people were not afforded the luxury of knowing their birthdays, of marking the passage of their years with celebration. Time for Micah was measured differently, in seasons of planting and harvest, in the rhythm of the lash, in the endless succession of days that blurred together into a singular experience of survival. If you're interested in stories of courage and resistance from American history, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Consider joining our membership community to support more content like this. Micah belonged to the Thornton family, one of Tallahassee's most prominent slaveholding dynasties. Colonel James Thornton owned over 200 enslaved people across 3 plantations, and he governed his empire with the cold precision of a man who viewed human beings as investments to be maximized. The Thornton estate sat on a rise overlooking acres of cotton fields, a white-columned mansion that proclaimed its owner's wealth and status to all who approached. Inside those walls, beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, existed a microcosm of the peculiar institution's absolute power, a world where white supremacy was not merely an ideology, but a lived reality enforced through violence, surveillance, and the constant threat of sale and separation. Micah worked as a house servant, a position that many enslaved people viewed with ambivalence. Housework spared him the brutal physicality of field labor, the back-breaking hours under the merciless sun, the overseer's whip constantly threatening. But proximity to the master's family brought its own dangers, its own particular forms of degradation. Micah saw everything: the casual cruelty, the hypocrisy, the way the Thorntons performed Christianity on Sundays while participating in a system of bondage that made a mockery of every sermon they claimed to believe. He served their meals, cleaned their chambers, stood silently in corners while they discussed politics and profit, always present yet rendered invisible by their assumption of his inferiority. The psychological toll of this enforced subservience, of having to mask every genuine emotion behind a performance of docility, was its own form of violence. The Thornton household operated according to rigid hierarchies, both among the white family members and among the enslaved people who served them. Colonel Thornton ruled with unquestioned authority, his word literally law within the boundaries of his property. His wife, Margaret Thornton, managed the domestic sphere with exacting standards, inspecting every corner for dust, every meal for imperfection, every enslaved person for signs of insubordination. Their children had been raised to view enslaved people as naturally inferior, inherently suited for servitude. The eldest son, Richard Thornton, had recently returned from service with a Confederate cavalry unit, wounded at Chickamauga, and deemed unfit for further combat. His return to civilian life had been marked by a restlessness, a violence that seemed to seek outlets in the exercise of power over those who could not resist. Richard Thornton was 28 years old, a man shaped by war and nursed on the poisonous ideology of racial supremacy. He had grown up watching his father wield absolute power over human beings, had been taught from childhood that this was the natural order of things, divinely ordained and economically necessary. The war had hardened something in him, had stripped away whatever thin veneer of paternalistic benevolence some slaveholders affected. He had seen the Union Army, had witnessed enslaved people fleeing to federal lines, had watched the Confederacy's cause begin to crumble. This had not produced in him any crisis of conscience or recognition of slavery's fundamental evil. Instead, it had intensified his commitment to the system, transformed him into someone determined to hold on to power through whatever means necessary. He was exactly the type of man the institution of slavery required and produced, someone capable of viewing other human beings as property without moral qualms. In December 1864, the Thornton family arranged Richard's marriage to Catherine Whitmore, the daughter of another prominent Tallahassee family. The union joined 2 slaveholding dynasties, consolidated wealth and social standing, strengthened political connections in a confederacy that was rapidly losing ground to Union forces. The wedding was planned as a defiant celebration, a statement that despite the war's progression, despite the rumors of Sherman's march through Georgia, despite whispers that enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines by the thousands, the Southern way of life would endure. No expense was spared in the preparations. The Thornton mansion was transformed into a showcase of Confederate gentility. Flowers imported despite wartime shortages, a feast prepared by enslaved cooks working around the clock, musicians hired, the finest wines procured through blockade runners, guest rooms prepared for relatives traveling from across the region. Micah was assigned to the wedding preparations. Working 18-hour days in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, he polished silver until it gleamed, arranged furniture, helped prepare the guest quarters, served at the rehearsal dinner. Throughout all of this, he maintained the mask that survival required, the downcast eyes, the deferential posture, the careful modulation of his voice to project humility rather than humanity. But behind this performance, Micah's mind was constantly working, constantly observing, constantly calculating. He had learned to read the white people around him, to anticipate their moods and demands, to navigate the impossible terrain of enslavement, where any misstep could result in punishment or sale. This hypervigilance was exhausting, but it was also what had kept him alive, what had allowed him to endure in a system designed to break the human spirit. The institution of slavery in Florida operated under laws that explicitly defined enslaved people as chattel property rather than human beings with rights. The state's black codes, like those throughout the Confederacy, created a comprehensive legal framework for subjugation. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in court, could not own property, could not marry legally, could not learn to read or write, could not move freely without written passes, could not gather in groups without white supervision. The laws authorized corporal punishment as a means of discipline and control. They made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read, recognizing that literacy was a pathway to consciousness and resistance. They established patrols to monitor the movements of enslaved people and to capture those who attempted to escape. Every aspect of the legal system was designed to maintain white supremacy and to prevent the possibility of black freedom. But laws, no matter how comprehensive or brutal, could not fully contain the human desire for liberty. Throughout the South, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, some dramatic and visible, others subtle and constant. They slowed their work pace, feigned illness, broke tools, spoiled crops. They created communities and cultures that sustained dignity in the face of degradation. They preserved family connections, despite a system that routinely separated parents from children, husbands from wives. They passed down stories and songs that kept alive the memory of Africa and the hope of freedom. They escaped when opportunities arose, fleeing to Union lines or attempting the dangerous journey north. They gathered information, staying informed about the war's progress through networks of communication that white people never suspected existed. And occasionally, when pushed beyond endurance, when the accumulation of violence and violation exceeded what the human spirit could bear, they struck back. Micah had witnessed many things during his years in the Thornton household, but nothing had prepared him for what occurred in the days immediately preceding Richard Thornton's wedding. The household was in a state of heightened tension, the increased activity creating opportunities for small infractions to escalate into major incidents. Richard himself seemed agitated, perhaps nervous about the approaching marriage, perhaps frustrated by his inability to return to military service, perhaps simply exercising the power that the system granted him over human beings he viewed as property. One afternoon, 3 days before the wedding, Micah entered the study to deliver afternoon refreshments and found Richard in conversation with several other young Confederate officers, men who had served with him and who were in Tallahassee for the wedding festivities. The men were drinking heavily, despite the early hour. Their conversation loud and animated, filled with boasts about wartime exploits and complaints about the war's progression. They spoke casually about violence against enslaved people, trading stories as if discussing hunting or sport. Richard, perhaps seeking to impress his companions, perhaps simply acting on impulses that the war had normalized, summoned another enslaved man who worked in the household, a young man named Samuel, perhaps 17 years old. What followed was a display of casual cruelty that shocked even those accustomed to slavery's daily violence. Richard accused Samuel of some minor infraction, something about improperly polished boots, though everyone present knew the accusation was pretextual. He ordered Samuel to assume a position of submission, then struck him repeatedly with a riding crop, while his companions watched and commented. Micah stood frozen in the corner of the room, still holding the tray of refreshments, forced to witness this brutality while maintaining his performance of docility. Samuel did not cry out. He had learned, as all enslaved people learned, that displaying pain only encouraged further violence. When Richard finally tired of the beating, he dismissed Samuel with a contemptuous gesture and returned to his conversation with his companions, who congratulated him on maintaining discipline among his slaves. The incident lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but for Micah, standing there powerless to intervene, it seemed to stretch into eternity. Something shifted inside him in that moment. Some final thread of accommodation snapped. He had endured so much, had swallowed so many humiliations, had performed submission for so many years. But watching another human being brutalized for entertainment, watching these men laugh and drink and treat violence as casual amusement, watching the system's absolute contempt for black humanity displayed so nakedly, it ignited something that had been smoldering for years. That night, lying on the rough pallet in the quarters assigned to house servants, Micah could not sleep. His mind replayed the afternoon scene again and again, but now intercut with other memories. His mother being sold when he was 8 years old, torn from his arms while he screamed and clung to her dress, the countless beatings he had witnessed or experienced, the daily degradations large and small, the constant surveillance and threat, the knowledge that he was viewed as property, as a thing rather than a person. The Confederacy was losing the war. Everyone knew this. Though white Southerners refused to admit it openly, Union forces were advancing. Enslaved people were fleeing to freedom. The institution of slavery was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions and the military pressure being applied against it. But here in Tallahassee, in the Thornton mansion, the system continued as if it would last forever, as if the violence and subjugation could be sustained indefinitely. The wedding was scheduled for December 17th, 1864, a Saturday afternoon ceremony to be held in the Thornton mansion's grand parlor, followed by an elaborate reception. In the days leading up to the event, the household's pace became frantic. Micah worked alongside dozens of other enslaved people, all of them preparing for a celebration that marked the joining of two slaveholding families, the perpetuation of the system that held them in bondage. There was a surreal quality to it, being forced to facilitate a ritual of joy and legitimacy for people who viewed you as subhuman property. The enslaved cooks prepared elaborate dishes. The enslaved housekeepers polished and cleaned until everything gleamed. The enslaved musicians practiced the pieces they would perform, and through it all, they maintained their masks, performed their assigned roles, gave no outward sign of the rage and grief and exhaustion that they carried within. The morning of December 17th dawned cold and clear, the kind of winter day that in other circumstances might have been called beautiful. Frost clung to the grass in the early hours, and the sky stretched overhead in a pale, unbroken expanse of blue. Inside the Thornton mansion, activity began before sunrise. Micah was awakened at 4 in the morning by the head housekeeper, an enslaved woman named Ruth, who had served the Thornton family for over 30 years. Her face bore the marks of those decades, lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth, a permanent weariness in her expression, a careful neutrality that came from years of swallowing every genuine emotion. She moved through the servants' quarters, rousing everyone for the day ahead, her voice low but insistent. There was no room for delay, no tolerance for anything less than perfection. The wedding would proceed according to Colonel Thornton's exacting standards, and any failure would be met with punishment. Micah dressed in the formal livery that house servants were required to wear for special occasions. Black trousers, a white shirt starched so stiff it felt like armor, a black vest and jacket that marked him as part of the household staff. The uniform was meant to convey a certain elegance, to demonstrate the Thornton family's wealth and refinement through the appearance of their servants, but wearing it felt like donning another layer of the mask, another element of the performance that enslavement required. He looked at himself briefly in a small, cracked mirror that hung in the quarters, a young man with dark eyes that held depths of feeling and intelligence that he could never safely display, a face that had learned to remain carefully neutral no matter what he witnessed or experienced. He barely recognized himself sometimes, so complete was the disconnect between his inner life and his outward presentation. The kitchen was already in full operation when Micah arrived to help with breakfast service for the family and early arriving wedding guests. The heat from multiple cooking fires made the room oppressive despite the cold morning outside. 3 enslaved women worked over the fires, their faces shining with sweat as they prepared biscuits, ham, eggs, grits, and the endless pots of coffee that white people seemed to require in infinite quantities. The head cook, a woman named Bessie who possessed remarkable culinary skills that the Thorntons claimed credit for, as if her abilities were their property rather than her own talent, moved between stations with practiced efficiency. She had been cooking since before dawn and would continue until long after midnight when the last wedding guests had been fed and satisfied. There was no rest for enslaved people on days like this, no consideration for their exhaustion or their own needs. They existed solely to serve, to facilitate white comfort and celebration. Throughout the morning, Micah carried trays, poured drinks, cleared dishes, responded to the constant stream of demands from family members and guests. The Thornton relatives had arrived over the previous days, filling the mansion's guest rooms and overflowing into neighboring houses. They were a collection of Confederate gentry, plantation owners, merchants who had grown wealthy through slave-produced cotton, political figures who had championed secession, military officers home on leave or recuperating from wounds. They spoke confidently about the war despite the Confederacy's increasingly desperate situation. They convinced themselves that foreign intervention might still arrive, that one decisive victory could turn the tide, that the South's cause was righteous and divinely ordained. They refused to acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious, that slavery was dying, that the system they had built their lives around was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, and the military pressure being applied by Union forces. Richard Thornton spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, drinking more than was wise before noon, alternating between jovial interactions with his groomsmen and sharp-tongued criticism of the enslaved staff. He found fault with the temperature of his coffee, with the crease in his trousers, with the timing of meal service. Each complaint was delivered with an edge of threat, a reminder that he possessed absolute power over the people serving him. Micah observed this behavior while maintaining his careful exterior of deference, but internally his contempt grew with each passing hour. This was the man being celebrated today, the man whose marriage would be toasted and blessed, the man who would be sent into married life with congratulations and well wishes. And he was a monster, someone who had demonstrated repeatedly his capacity for casual cruelty, someone who viewed human beings as objects to be used and discarded at will. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, allowing time for the midday meal and for guests to arrive from across the region. Despite the war, despite the shortages that affected even wealthy families, the Thorntons had managed to create an impressive display. The parlor had been transformed into a wedding venue, flowers arranged throughout the room despite December's cold, chairs positioned in neat rows, an improvised altar created at the far end where the minister would perform the ceremony. The enslaved musicians had been positioned discreetly to one side, ready to provide appropriate music. Every surface had been polished to a high shine. The silver gleamed. The crystal sparkled in the afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows. It was a testament to enslaved labor, to skills and efforts that would receive no recognition or compensation, to the extraction of beauty and elegance through coercion and violence. Catherine Whitmore arrived at 2 o'clock with her family and bridesmaids. She was 19 years old, dressed in a gown that had been crafted by enslaved seamstresses who had worked for weeks to meet her exacting standards. Her father, Samuel Whitmore, owned one of the largest plantations in Leon County, and the marriage solidified an already close relationship between 2 of Tallahassee's most powerful families. Catherine had been raised in the same system as Richard, taught from childhood that enslaved people were naturally inferior, that slavery was a benevolent institution, that civilized and Christianized Africans who would otherwise remain savage. She had never questioned these teachings, had never examined the violence and degradation upon which her comfortable life was built. She saw Micah and the other enslaved servants as part of the landscape, as fixtures of her world rather than as fully human beings with their own inner lives and aspirations. As the ceremony hour approached, guests filled the parlor, taking their seats amid a rustle of silk and conversation. The air was thick with perfume and the scent of the flowers that had been arranged throughout the room. Confederate officers in their gray uniforms mingled with civilians in their finest attire. Women displayed jewelry and gowns that represented substantial wealth despite wartime shortages. There was a defiant quality to the gathering, a determination to celebrate and maintain normalcy, even as the world they knew was crumbling around them. They spoke in hushed tones about recent news, Sherman's march through Georgia, the fall of Savannah, the increasing desperation of the Confederate military situation, but they pushed these concerns aside for the afternoon, choosing to focus on the wedding. On this assertion of continuity and tradition, Micah stood at his assigned position near the parlor entrance, ready to attend to any needs that might arise during the ceremony. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire gathering, the assembled guests, the nervous groom, the arriving bride, the minister preparing his notes. He maintained his mask of neutral service, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over thoughts that had been building since the incident with Samuel days earlier. He thought about his mother, sold away when he was a child, her fate unknown. He thought about friends who had attempted to escape and been caught, their punishments serving as warnings to others who might contemplate flight. He thought about the casual brutality he witnessed daily, the way enslaved people were spoken to and about, the complete lack of recognition of their humanity. He thought about the war, about Union forces advancing, about the possibility that slavery might actually end. And he thought about Richard Thornton, about the man who was about to be married while the blood of Samuel's beating was barely dry. The ceremony began precisely at 3 o'clock. The enslaved musicians played as Catherine entered on her father's arm, moving slowly down the makeshift aisle between the rows of seated guests. Richard waited at the altar, looking pleased with himself, accepting the congratulatory nods and smiles from the assembled company. The minister, a Presbyterian clergyman who owned 12 enslaved people himself and regularly preached that slavery was biblically ordained, opened with a prayer thanking God for the institution of marriage and for the natural order of society. He spoke of Christian duty, of the roles that men and women were meant to fulfill, of the building of godly families and the perpetuation of civilization. His words dripped with hypocrisy, invoking divine blessing for a union taking place within a system of absolute violence and subjugation. Micah watched as the ceremony proceeded through its familiar stages, the exchange of vows, the blessing of the rings, the pronouncement of marriage, the kiss that sealed the union. Throughout it all, the enslaved servants remained at their posts, invisible to the celebrating guests except when their service was required. They were present but unseen, their labor essential but unacknowledged, their humanity denied even as they facilitated this ritual that proclaimed the sanctity of human connection and commitment. The contradiction was so stark, so obscene, that Micah felt something twist inside him. These people who spoke of love and family and Christian values were the same people who separated enslaved families without remorse, who viewed black children as property to be bought and sold, who reduced human beings to the status of livestock. The reception that followed the ceremony was elaborate by any standard, remarkable given wartime conditions. The dining room table groaned under the weight of dishes that enslaved cooks had prepared. Roasted meats, elaborate side dishes, breads and pastries, desserts that required ingredients that were increasingly scarce in the blockaded Confederacy. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and elevating spirits. Toasts were offered to the newlyweds, to the Confederacy, to the Southern way of life. Confederate officers told war stories, carefully editing out the defeats and disasters, emphasizing instead moments of valor and victory. The women discussed fashion and social events, planning future gatherings as if the world were not falling apart around them. And through it all, enslaved servants moved like shadows, serving and clearing, attending to every need, absorbing insults and commands without outward reaction. Micah served wine and cleared plates, moving through the crowded dining room with the practiced efficiency that came from years of this work. He heard everything: the casual discussions of enslaved people as property, the plans to expand plantations once the war was won, the complaints about enslaved workers who were becoming difficult to manage as news of Union advances spread. He heard Richard Thornton boast to his new brother-in-law about his methods of discipline, describing the beating of Samuel as if it were an achievement worth celebrating. He heard guests laugh at jokes that dehumanized black people, that treated their suffering as comedy, and with each passing hour, with each new demonstration of the system's casual cruelty and absolute contempt, something hardened inside him. The mask he wore felt thinner, more fragile. The rage he had learned to suppress pressed against the boundaries of his control. As evening approached and the reception continued, the wedding party moved from the dining room to the parlor for music and dancing. The enslaved musicians played waltzes and reels while white people danced, their movements graceful and practiced, their faces flushed with wine and celebration. Micah and the other house servants circulated with trays of drinks and small delicacies, ensuring that the celebration never flagged. that no guest went unattended. The work was exhausting, both physically and psychologically. The constant vigilance required to anticipate needs, to avoid giving offense, to maintain the performance of contented servitude, while suppressing every genuine emotion. It extracted a toll that was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, as the reception reached its peak of revelry, Colonel Thornton called for attention and offered a lengthy toast to the newlyweds. He spoke of family legacy, of the importance of preserving Southern traditions, of the need to maintain their way of life against the threats posed by Northern aggression. He spoke of Richard's military service, of Catherine's family's prominence, of the bright future that awaited them. His words painted a picture of permanence and continuity, a vision of the South's slave-holding aristocracy extending indefinitely into the future. The assembled guests cheered and raised their glasses, buying into this fantasy even as reality told a different story. Enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines by the thousands. Confederate military forces were collapsing. The institution of slavery was dying. But here, in this room, these people convinced themselves that nothing fundamental would change, that their power was eternal and unassailable. The evening wore on, and gradually guests began to retire to their rooms or depart for their own homes. By midnight, only the immediate family and closest friends remained. The enslaved staff began the work of cleaning up after the celebration, clearing dishes, putting away food, restoring order to rooms that had been disrupted by hours of partying. Micah worked mechanically, his exhaustion so profound that he moved almost without conscious thought. He had been awake for over 20 hours, had been on his feet for most of that time, had performed labor that was both physically demanding and psychologically draining, but there would be no rest yet. The work had to be completed before any of the enslaved staff could retire. Their needs were irrelevant compared to the importance of restoring the mansion to its proper state. Around 1 in the morning, as Micah carried a tray of dirty dishes toward the kitchen, he passed through the main hallway and heard sounds from the study. Richard's voice raised in anger, a woman's voice pleading. He should have continued on, should have minded his own business as survival required, but something made him pause, made him set down the tray and move closer to the partially open door. What he saw through the gap made his blood run cold. Richard Thornton, drunk and belligerent, was berating an enslaved woman named Ella, accusing her of some imagined slight during the evening's festivities. Catherine stood to the side, not intervening, not objecting, simply watching as her new husband exercised his power. Richard's hand struck Ella across the face, the sound sharp and shocking in the quiet house. She stumbled but did not fall, did not cry out. Maintaining the silence that might be her only protection against further violence, Micah stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Through the gap in the study door, he watched as Richard struck Ella again, this time with more force, sending her to her knees. Catherine Thornton, she had taken her husband's name just hours earlier, stood with her arms crossed, her face displaying not horror or compassion, but mild irritation, as if the scene before her was merely an inconvenience rather than an act of violence against another human being. She had been raised to view such displays as normal, as the proper exercise of authority over property that refused to behave correctly. The wedding dress she still wore seemed to glow in the lamplight, a symbol of purity and sanctity, rendered obscene by the brutality unfolding in its presence. Richard's voice was slurred from alcohol, his words running together as he continued his tirade. "You think you can serve my guests with that attitude? You think I don't see the way you look at me? The insolence in your eyes?" Each accusation was punctuated with another blow, a slap, a shove, a kick, as Ella tried to protect herself on the floor. The charges were fabricated, pretexts for violence that Richard seemed to need as an outlet for something darker within him. Perhaps it was the war, perhaps it was the alcohol, perhaps it was simply the natural expression of a system that granted absolute power to men like him over people like Ella. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. A young woman being brutalized on what was supposed to be a day of celebration and joy, her suffering invisible to everyone except those forced to witness it. Micah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to stop this, to do something. But survival instincts honed over years of enslavement held him in place. To interfere would mean death or something worse. No enslaved person could raise a hand to defend another without facing consequences that extended beyond the individual to the entire community. The retaliation would be swift and brutal, not just against him, but against others as a lesson and deterrent. Colonel Thornton would make an example that no one would forget. Micah had seen it before, had witnessed what happened when enslaved people dared to resist. The system was designed to make resistance seem impossible, to convince the oppressed that any attempt to fight back would only result in greater suffering. But as Micah stood there, paralyzed between the impulse to act and the knowledge of consequences, something shifted inside him. He thought about Samuel, beaten days earlier for Richard's amusement. He thought about his mother, ripped away when he was 8 years old. He thought about the countless humiliations and violations he had endured and witnessed. He thought about the wedding ceremony earlier that day, about the minister invoking God's blessing on a union that would perpetuate this system of violence and degradation. He thought about the reception, about wealthy white people celebrating while enslaved servants worked themselves to exhaustion. He thought about the casual way Richard had boasted about beating Samuel, the laughter from his companions, the complete absence of any recognition of black humanity. And something inside him, some final thread of accommodation, some last fragment of the survival mechanism that had kept him alive but compliant, simply snapped. The study contained several objects that could serve as weapons. Micah's eyes fell on a heavy brass candlestick on the table near the door, an ornate piece that Colonel Thornton had brought back from a trip to Charleston years earlier. Later, when people tried to reconstruct the events of that night, they would debate whether what happened next was premeditated or spontaneous. The truth was more complex than either explanation allowed. Micah had not planned violence, had not entered the hallway with the intention of attacking Richard Thornton, but neither was his action purely impulsive. It emerged from an accumulation of trauma and rage, from the slow building of pressure over years of subjugation, from the recognition that some thresholds once crossed cannot be uncrossed. It was both an individual act and a product of the system that had created the conditions for its own violation. Micah picked up the candlestick. Its weight was substantial, perhaps 3 pounds of solid brass. He pushed the study door fully open and stepped inside. Richard turned at the sound, his face flushed from alcohol and exertion, his eyes taking a moment to focus on the figure entering the room. When he registered who it was, one of the house servants, someone whose name he probably didn't even know despite years of being served by him, his expression shifted to anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice carrying the automatic assumption of authority that white men in his position never questioned. "Get out of here before I have you whipped for insolence." But Micah did not leave. He moved forward, the candlestick held firmly in his right hand. Catherine saw it first, her eyes widening as she processed what was happening. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, Micah was across the room. The candlestick came down hard against the side of Richard's head with a sickening thud. Richard collapsed immediately, blood flowing from a wound above his ear, his body going limp as he hit the floor. The whole sequence had taken perhaps 5 seconds. 5 seconds during which the entire architecture of Micah's world had been demolished, during which he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, during which he had done something that the system defined as the ultimate crime an enslaved person could commit. Catherine found her voice then, a scream that pierced the quiet house like a knife. Micah stood over Richard's unconscious body, the candlestick still in his hand, his chest heaving with adrenaline and terror, and something that felt almost like exhilaration. He had struck back. After 25 years of submission, after countless humiliations and violations, after watching others suffer and being unable to help, he had finally acted. The cost would be everything. His life, certainly, and probably the lives of others, as the system extracted its revenge. But in that moment, standing over the man who embodied everything brutal and evil about slavery, Micah felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of his own power, his own agency, his own refusal to accept the role that had been forced upon him. Stories like Micah's reveal the individual courage behind broader movements for freedom. If this narrative resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from? And consider joining our membership community to help us continue bringing these important historical stories to light. Ella scrambled to her feet, her face showing shock and fear in equal measure. She understood immediately what Micah had done, what it meant, what consequences would follow. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll kill you for this. They'll kill all of us." Her words stated the obvious truth. The system's response to enslaved resistance, particularly violence against white people, was swift and brutal. The laws of every southern state prescribed death for enslaved people who struck their enslavers. But more than legal punishment, there was the extra-legal violence that white communities inflicted as demonstrations of power and warnings against future resistance. Lynchings, torture, public executions designed to terrorize the enslaved population into submission, these were the tools the system employed to maintain control. Catherine's screams had awakened the household. Micah could hear doors opening upstairs, footsteps running, voices calling out in alarm. He had perhaps 30 seconds before people arrived at the study, perhaps a minute before the full weight of the system descended upon him. Every rational calculation said that he should flee immediately, should run for the door and try to escape into the night. But something held him in place, some need to bear witness to what he had done, to own this action rather than flee from it. He looked down at Richard's unconscious form, at the blood pooling on the expensive carpet, at Catherine backed against the wall in her wedding dress. This was what resistance looked like, messy, violent, without clear resolution or noble speeches. It was desperate and dangerous, and probably futile, but it was also undeniably real, an assertion of humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. Colonel Thornton arrived first, still in his evening clothes, a pistol in his hand that he always kept loaded in his bedside table. His eyes took in the scene, his son unconscious on the floor, Catherine screaming hysterically, Ella standing against the wall with her face marked by Richard's blows, and Micah in the center of it all with the bloody candlestick still in his hand. The colonel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, comprehension, and then a rage so profound that for a moment he seemed unable to speak. When words finally came, they emerged as a roar that shook the room. "You struck my son. You dared to raise your hand against a white man." Micah said nothing. What could he say that would matter? What explanation could he offer that would be heard by people who viewed him as property rather than as a person? He simply stood there, the candlestick falling from his hand to the floor with a heavy thud, accepting what was about to happen. Other members of the household arrived. Margaret Thornton, several guests who had remained overnight, other enslaved servants drawn by the commotion. The study became crowded with people, all of them trying to understand what had occurred, all of them shocked by the violation of the fundamental rules that governed their world. An enslaved person had struck a white person. It was unthinkable, impossible, a crime so grave that it threatened the very foundations of the social order they believed in. Someone checked Richard's pulse and confirmed that he was still alive, though unconscious and bleeding heavily from the head wound. This fact saved Micah from immediate execution. If Richard had been dead, the colonel might have shot Micah on the spot. Instead, he ordered several enslaved men to seize Micah and secure him in the cellar, while decisions were made about what should happen next. They grabbed Micah's arms, their faces apologetic, but their grips firm. They understood that they had no choice, that failure to comply with the colonel's orders would result in punishment for them as well. They were caught in the same system that had just driven Micah to his desperate act, powerless to resist, even as they facilitated his capture. The cellar was cold and dark, accessed through a heavy wooden door that led to stone steps descending into the earth. The Thorntons used it for storage, wine, preserved foods, equipment that was only needed seasonally, but it also served another purpose, one that was never explicitly discussed, but that everyone understood. It was where enslaved people were confined when they needed to be isolated, where punishment could be administered away from the sight of visitors who might find such displays distasteful. Micah was pushed down the stairs, his hands bound behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists. The door slammed shut above him, the sound of a heavy bolt being driven home. The darkness was absolute, broken only by thin lines of light around the doorframe. Micah sat on the cold stone floor, his back against the wall, and waited. His body trembled with adrenaline and fear, but beneath those reactions was something else, a strange calm, a sense of having finally acted rather than simply endured. He had struck back at the system that had held him in bondage his entire life. The cost would be everything, but in that moment, he found that he could not regret what he had done. He had seen Ella being beaten, had watched Richard exercise the casual cruelty that the system enabled and encouraged, and he had said no. He had refused to stand by, had refused to accept that this was simply how things were. That refusal, even if it cost him his life, felt like the most fully human thing he had ever done. Above him, he could hear movement and raised voices as the household dealt with the aftermath of his action. Richard was being attended to by a doctor who lived nearby and had been summoned urgently. Colonel Thornton was consulting with the other white men present about the appropriate response. Margaret Thornton was comforting Catherine, who had collapsed in hysterics. The enslaved servants were being questioned about what they had seen, about whether they had known of Micah's intentions, about whether there were others involved in what some were already characterizing as an insurrection. The entire household was in chaos, the wedding celebration transformed into crisis and fear, and at the center of it all was a single act of resistance, one enslaved man's refusal to accept the role assigned to him by a system built on violence and degradation. Hours passed in the darkness of the cellar. Though Micah had no way to measure their passage, time became abstract, stretched and compressed simultaneously by fear and exhaustion and the adrenaline that still coursed through his body. He could hear muffled sounds from above, footsteps crossing the floors, doors opening and closing, voices rising and falling in heated discussion. Occasionally, he caught fragments of conversation through the floorboards, words that painted a picture of the chaos his action had unleashed. Richard had regained consciousness, but was badly injured, drifting in and out of lucidity. The doctor had warned that head wounds were unpredictable, that the next 24 hours would determine whether he survived. Colonel Thornton was calling for immediate execution, demanding that Micah be hanged from the nearest tree as an example, but others were counseling caution, arguing that due process needed to be followed, that a public trial would serve the interests of social order better than vigilante justice. The debate was not about Micah's guilt. That was assumed without question. The debate was about method, about how his punishment should be administered to maximize its deterrent effect on other enslaved people. This was the calculus of terror that underpinned the entire system. Every punishment inflicted on an enslaved person served a dual purpose: retribution for the specific act and warning to others contemplating resistance. The spectacle of punishment was as important as the punishment itself. Public whippings, brandings, mutilations, executions. These were performed not just to harm the individual, but to terrorize the community, to demonstrate the absolute power of white supremacy and the futility of resistance. The system required enslaved people to witness these displays, to internalize the message that defiance would be met with overwhelming violence. As dawn approached, Micah heard the cellar bolt being drawn back. The door opened, allowing gray morning light to spill down the stairs. Two white men descended, Colonel Thornton and Sheriff Marcus Webb, a man who had built his career on enforcing the laws that maintained slavery. The sheriff carried leg irons, heavy iron shackles connected by a short chain that would prevent Micah from running. He attached them with practiced efficiency, the metal cold and heavy around Micah's ankles. Colonel Thornton held a lantern, its light throwing harsh shadows across his face. He looked like he had not slept, his eyes red-rimmed and blazing with fury, barely contained by the veneer of civilized behavior he maintained even now. "Do you understand what you've done?" the colonel asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you comprehend the magnitude of your crime?" He did not wait for an answer, did not actually want one. "You have struck my son. You have violated the most fundamental law of our society. You have committed an act that cannot be tolerated, that demands the most severe response. When word of this spreads, and it will spread, every slaveholder in the state will be watching to see how we handle this situation. If we show weakness, if we fail to respond with appropriate force, it will embolden others to follow your example. Do you understand the responsibility you have placed upon us?" The colonel's words revealed the essential truth about the system's brutality. The violence was not merely personal revenge, though that certainly motivated men like Thornton. It was structural, necessary to maintain a social order built upon the subjugation of human beings who outnumbered their enslavers and who would, if given any opportunity, seek freedom. The constant threat of overwhelming violence was what kept the system functioning. Without it, without the daily demonstrations of power and the spectacular punishments inflicted on those who dared to resist, the entire edifice would collapse. Micah's act threatened not just the Thornton family, but the very foundations of the world these men had built and profited from. Sheriff Webb pulled Micah to his feet, the chains making it difficult to climb the stone steps. They emerged into a household transformed by the events of the previous night. The wedding decorations still hung in the parlor, now seeming grotesque and out of place. Enslaved servants moved through the rooms with downcast eyes, their fear palpable. They knew that Micah's punishment would be terrible, and they knew that the system might not stop with him. Collective punishment was a common response to enslaved resistance. Beating or selling multiple people, as a demonstration that the entire community bore responsibility for individual actions. This was how the system maintained control, despite being vastly outnumbered, by making enslaved people police each other, by creating an atmosphere where any act of resistance put the entire community at risk. They took Micah to the county jail, a small brick building in downtown Tallahassee that held criminals awaiting trial or execution. The journey through the awakening town drew stares and whispers. News of the incident had already spread. Enslaved people communicated through networks that white people never fully understood or controlled, passing information through coded conversations, songs, and the daily movements that brought them into contact with each other. By the time they reached the jail, a small crowd had gathered, white citizens curious about the enslaved man who had dared to strike his master's son, enslaved people watching with expressions that ranged from fear to something else, something that might have been solidarity or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that Micah had done what many thought about but never attempted. The jail cell was small and filthy, with a single barred window set high in the wall. The iron door clanged shut with a finality that seemed to seal Micah's fate. Sheriff Webb removed the leg irons but left his hands bound, then departed without a word. Micah was alone again, but this solitude felt different from the cellar's darkness. Here there was light, pale winter sunlight filtering through the window. Here he could see the bars that confined him, could measure the dimensions of his imprisonment, and here he had time to think about what he had done, what it meant, and what would come next. The legal proceedings began with remarkable speed. In other circumstances, in a different case involving a white defendant, weeks or months might pass between arrest and trial. But enslaved people accused of violence against whites were processed with urgent efficiency. The system could not afford to let such cases linger, could not risk that delay might be interpreted as weakness or uncertainty. By the afternoon of December 18th, less than 24 hours after Micah had struck Richard Thornton, a grand jury had been convened and had returned an indictment for assault with intent to kill. The trial was scheduled for the following day, a Monday morning. The speed was designed to minimize the period during which enslaved people might contemplate Micah's action and draw inspiration from it, to demonstrate that punishment followed swiftly and inevitably from resistance. Micah was not provided with an attorney. Florida law, like that of other slave states, did not guarantee legal representation to enslaved people accused of crimes. In theory, the court could appoint counsel if it chose. In practice, this rarely happened, especially in cases involving violence against whites. The assumption of guilt was so complete, the outcome so predetermined, that the trial itself was largely theatrical, a performance designed to lend legitimacy to a conclusion that had been reached the moment Micah struck Richard Thornton. The law existed not to protect enslaved people, but to codify their subjugation, to give the appearance of justice to what was actually systematic oppression. That night, as Micah sat in his cell watching moonlight creep across the floor, he received an unexpected visitor. Ruth, the head housekeeper from the Thornton estate, appeared at the bars accompanied by Sheriff Webb. She carried a small bundle, food, water, a blanket. Webb unlocked the cell to allow her entry, then stood watch at the door. Ruth's face was carefully neutral as she handed Micah the provisions, but when she was certain the sheriff could not see her expression, something flickered across her features. Grief, solidarity, perhaps even pride. "Ella is all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The colonel questioned her but concluded she had nothing to do with what happened. The others send their prayers. Ruth's visit was a profound act of courage. She risked punishment simply by showing compassion to someone accused of striking a white man. But it was also a testament to the bonds that existed among enslaved people, connections that the system tried to destroy but could never fully eliminate. In that brief moment, with Ruth's hand touching his shoulder, Micah felt less alone. His action had been individual, but it existed within a collective experience of oppression and resistance. Others understood why he had done what he did, even if they could not openly acknowledge it. They recognized in his desperate act their own suppressed rage, their own desire to strike back at a system that degraded and violated them daily. The trial began at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, December 19, 1864. The courtroom was packed with spectators, white citizens eager to witness justice being served, a handful of enslaved people allowed to observe as part of the deterrent spectacle. The judge, a man named Horace Blackwell, who owned 40 enslaved people himself, presided with stern authority. The prosecutor, Thomas Hendricks, was known for his zealous enforcement of laws governing enslaved people. There was no defense attorney. Micah stood alone before the court, his hands still bound, his fate already sealed by laws that viewed him as property rather than a person with rights. The prosecution's case was simple and brief. Catherine Thornton testified first, describing how Micah had entered the study and struck Richard without warning or provocation. She made no mention of Richard beating Ella, no reference to the violence that had preceded Micah's action. Her version of events portrayed Micah's attack as completely unprovoked, an act of pure savagery that confirmed racist beliefs about the dangerous nature of enslaved people. Colonel Thornton testified next, speaking about Micah's character, claiming that he had always been sullen and insubordinate despite the family's Christian benevolence toward their slaves. The doctor who had treated Richard testified about the severity of the injury, noting that such blows could easily prove fatal and that Richard remained in serious condition. Micah was not permitted to testify on his own behalf. Florida law prohibited enslaved people from giving testimony in cases involving white people, except under extremely limited circumstances. His version of events, that he had witnessed Richard beating Ella, that he had acted to stop ongoing violence, would not be heard by the court. Ella was not called as a witness, her experience deemed irrelevant to the legal proceedings. The trial was not about establishing truth or weighing competing narratives. It was about demonstrating power, about showing enslaved people what happened when they dared to resist, about maintaining a social order built upon racial subjugation. The judge's instructions to the jury were perfunctory. Under Florida law, an enslaved person who struck a white person with an object capable of causing serious injury was presumed to have intended to kill. The only question the jury needed to decide was whether Micah had in fact struck Richard Thornton. Given the testimony and Micah's presence at the scene with the bloody candlestick in his hand, the answer was obvious. The jury deliberated for less than 15 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. Judge Blackwell pronounced sentence immediately, death by hanging, to be carried out on December 23rd at noon in the town square. The execution would be public, a spectacle designed to terrorize other enslaved people and to demonstrate white supremacy's absolute power. As Micah was led from the courtroom back to his cell, he caught glimpses of faces in the crowd. Some showed satisfaction, the pleasure of seeing proper order maintained. Others displayed a kind of hungry excitement, anticipating the spectacle of the execution. But among the enslaved people present, he saw different expressions. Fear, certainly, but also something else: recognition, understanding, a shared knowledge of the impossible position that the system created, where submission meant slow death of the spirit and resistance meant swift death of the body. Micah had chosen resistance, and while they could not openly support that choice without risking their own lives, some part of them honored it, understood it as a fully human response to inhuman conditions. The days between sentencing and execution passed with excruciating slowness. Micah sat in his cell as December unfolded outside the barred window, marking time by the quality of light and the distant sounds of Tallahassee going about its business. The town was preparing for Christmas, and occasionally he could hear carols being sung, the incongruity of celebrating the birth of a savior who preached love and compassion while preparing to execute a man for defending another human being from violence. The contradiction seemed to trouble no one but him. White Christians in the slave South had long since reconciled their faith with their participation in a system of bondage, constructing elaborate theological justifications that allowed them to worship on Sunday and brutalize human beings on Monday without experiencing cognitive dissonance. News from the outside filtered in through Sheriff Webb, who proved less cruel than some might have been in his position. He informed Micah that Richard Thornton had survived the blow and was recovering. Though his personality had reportedly changed, he was more irritable, prone to sudden rages, experiencing headaches that left him incapacitated for hours. The injury had marked him permanently, just as his actions had marked Micah. But Richard would live, would eventually marry Catherine again in a quiet ceremony, since the first had been so violently disrupted, would go on to father children and manage his father's plantation. He would survive to see the Confederacy's defeat and slavery's end, though he would spend the rest of his life bitter about the loss of the world he had known. Micah, on the other hand, would not see the new year, would not witness the freedom that was coming, would not live to know that his act of resistance was part of a larger story of black people refusing to accept subjugation. On December 22nd, the day before the scheduled execution, Micah received a visitor he had not expected. Reverend Samuel Morrison was a white Presbyterian minister who sometimes visited prisoners awaiting execution, offering spiritual counsel and the hope of salvation in the next life, if not this one. He was a small man with gentle eyes, and unlike many white ministers who preached that slavery was divinely ordained, he seemed troubled by the institution even as he participated in it. He entered Micah's cell with a Bible in hand, his expression conveying both pity and discomfort. "I've come to speak with you about your immortal soul," he began, his voice soft. "Tomorrow you will stand before God's judgment. I want to help you prepare for that meeting." Micah looked at the minister for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me, Reverend," he said, his voice hoarse from days of minimal use. "Does your God approve of a system where human beings are bought and sold like cattle? Does he smile upon men who beat women for their amusement? Does he demand that I submit to violence and degradation without resistance? Because if that is the God you serve, then I want nothing to do with him." The words came out with more force than Micah had intended, months and years of suppressed questions and rage suddenly finding voice. "I saw a woman being beaten on her master's wedding night. I stopped it. For that I am to hang. What does your Bible say about that?" Reverend Morrison flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth to respond with the standard justifications, that earthly suffering was temporary, that submission to lawful authority was a Christian duty, that salvation came through faith rather than works. But something in Micah's gaze stopped him, forced him to confront the chasm between his professed beliefs and the reality of the system he tacitly supported. "I cannot answer your questions," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have struggled with these contradictions my entire ministry. I tell myself that I am bringing comfort, offering hope of heaven, but you are right to challenge me. The system we have built, it is an offense against everything Christ taught. And yet I participate in it, justify it, benefit from it. I am complicit in your death, and I do not know how to reconcile that with my faith." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Micah had experienced. A white man, a minister, acknowledging the fundamental evil of slavery, even if only privately, even if too late to matter for Micah's fate. They spoke for hours, Morrison asking questions that he had never dared voice publicly, Micah answering with the clarity that comes when there is nothing left to lose. They discussed the Bible, with Micah pointing out passages about liberation and justice that white preachers conveniently ignored. They talked about the war, about what might come after, about whether the South could survive the death of the institution it had built itself upon. When Morrison finally left, he clasped Micah's hand through the bars, a gesture of human connection that violated every social norm of their world. "I will pray for you," he said, tears in his eyes, "and I will pray for forgiveness for my own sins, for the ways I have failed to speak truth to power." That night Micah slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of his mother, of Samuel being beaten, of Ella's face marked by Richard's blows. He woke repeatedly to find himself still in the cell, still waiting for dawn and the execution that would follow. Part of him wanted to rage against the injustice, to scream and fight, and make his death difficult for those who would carry it out. But another part of him felt a strange peace. He had acted according to his conscience, had refused to stand by while another human being was brutalized. The system might kill him for that choice, might use his death as a warning to others, but it could not erase the fact that he had chosen resistance over submission. In a world designed to strip enslaved people of agency and humanity, that choice carried profound meaning. December 23rd dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning where frost sparkled on bare branches and breath fogged in the air. Sheriff Webb arrived at the cell with breakfast, eggs and grits and coffee, a better meal than Micah had received during his imprisonment. The condemned man was entitled to a final meal, one last gesture of humanity before the state took his life. Micah ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind focused on what lay ahead. At 11 o'clock, Webb returned with 2 deputies. They bound Micah's hands behind his back and placed the leg irons on his ankles once more. The chains made walking difficult, forcing him to shuffle in small steps. This was intentional. Part of the spectacle of execution was the visible subjugation of the condemned, the demonstration of absolute power over their body, even in death. The walk from the jail to the town square took 15 minutes, though it felt much longer. Crowds lined the streets, white citizens turning out to witness the execution, enslaved people forced to watch as a lesson in what happened to those who dared resist. Some faces showed satisfaction or grim approval, others displayed something closer to hunger, a disturbing excitement at the prospect of witnessing death. But Micah also saw enslaved faces in the crowd, and in their eyes he recognized a complex mixture of fear, grief, and something that might have been respect. They understood what he had done and why. Even if they could not openly acknowledge it, his death would traumatize them, would reinforce the terror that kept the system functioning, but it would also enter into the collective memory, would become one more story of resistance that enslaved people told each other in moments of privacy, one more example of someone who had refused to accept the role assigned to them. The gallows had been erected in the town square, a wooden platform with steps leading up to it, and a noose hanging from a crossbeam. The structure was temporary, built specifically for this execution and ones like it, but its message was permanent. This is what happens to those who resist. A crowd of several hundred people had gathered, spilling out into the surrounding streets. Armed militia members maintained order, ensuring that the execution proceeded smoothly. Judge Blackwell was present, as was Colonel Thornton, both men there to witness the completion of justice as they understood it. Richard Thornton was absent, still recovering from his injury, but Catherine stood near her father-in-law, her face showing no emotion as she prepared to watch the man who had disrupted her wedding die. Sheriff Webb led Micah up the steps to the platform. His legs felt unsteady, whether from fear or from the chains that restricted his movement. The noose was placed around his neck, the rope rough against his skin. Webb asked if he had any final words, a tradition that was sometimes extended to condemned prisoners, allowing them one last moment to speak before death. Micah looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces of enslaved people scattered throughout, at the white citizens who had come to witness his death. For a moment, he considered remaining silent, denying them even the satisfaction of hearing his voice. But then he spoke, his words carrying across the square in the cold morning air. "I did what I did because I could not stand by and watch another human being brutalized," Micah said, his voice steady, despite the fear coursing through him. "You call it a crime. You say I violated your laws, but your laws were written to protect a system built on violence and degradation. I am not sorry for what I did. I am only sorry that there are not more willing to do the same. The day is coming when this system will fall, when the chains you have placed on us will be broken. You can hang me today, but you cannot hang the truth. We are human beings and we will be free." This is the final chapter of Micah's story, but his courage echoes through history as part of the larger struggle for freedom and human dignity. If this video moved you, please like, subscribe, and join our membership community to support more stories that honor those who resisted injustice. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. The crowd reacted with mixed responses to Micah's words. Some white citizens shouted insults and condemnations, angered by his refusal to express remorse or beg for mercy. Others stood silent, perhaps uncomfortable with the execution, even if they supported the system it defended. Among the enslaved people present, there was visible emotion, tears, clenched fists held at sides, faces that struggled to maintain the neutral expression that survival required. Micah's words would be remembered and repeated, would become part of the oral tradition through which enslaved people preserved stories of resistance and hope. Sheriff Webb placed a black hood over Micah's head, blocking his vision but not his awareness of what was about to happen. He could hear the crowd's murmurs, could feel the platform beneath his feet, could sense the presence of death just moments away. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. He thought of his mother, wondering if he would see her in whatever came after death. He thought of Ella, hoping she had been spared further punishment. He thought of all the enslaved people watching, hoping his death would not simply terrorize them, but would also show them that resistance was possible, that submission was not the only option. And then he heard Sheriff Webb step back, heard the lever being pulled, felt the trapdoor open beneath his feet. The fall was brief, perhaps 8 feet. The rope snapped taut, breaking Micah's neck almost instantly. Death came quickly, more merciful than many executions of the era, which left the condemned strangling slowly at the end of the rope. His body swung gently in the winter wind, a sight designed to imprint itself on the memory of everyone present, particularly the enslaved people who had been forced to watch. The crowd began to disperse, some quickly as if eager to escape what they had witnessed, others lingering to discuss the execution and its implications. The militia members maintained their positions, ensuring that no disturbance occurred, that the execution's message was received without resistance or complication. Micah's body was left hanging for several hours, another element of the spectacle, another demonstration of power. When it was finally cut down, it was placed in a plain pine coffin and buried in the section of the town cemetery designated for enslaved people, marked only by a wooden cross with no name. Colonel Thornton had decreed that no marker bearing Micah's name would be erected, as if erasing his identity could somehow undo his action or prevent others from remembering him. But memory is not so easily controlled. Among the enslaved community in Tallahassee and beyond, the story of Micah spread, the young man who had struck back against his oppressor, who had refused to stand by while another was brutalized, who had spoken truth even in the face of death. The war that had provided the backdrop to Micah's story continued for another 4 months after his execution. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Confederacy's military resistance. On April 20th, Tallahassee became the only Confederate state capital east of the Mississippi River not to fall to Union forces before the war's end, surrendering peacefully after Lee's surrender made continued resistance pointless. And on December 18, 1865, exactly 1 year after Micah struck Richard Thornton, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, officially abolishing slavery throughout the nation. The system that had taken Micah's life had indeed fallen, just as he had predicted in his final words. The institution that white Southerners had insisted was permanent and divinely ordained had collapsed in blood and fire. The Thornton family survived the war but never recovered its former prominence. Colonel Thornton died in 1867, broken by the loss of his wealth and way of life. Richard struggled to adapt to a world where he could no longer exercise absolute power over other human beings. The plantation was eventually sold to pay debts. Catherine raised their children in relative poverty compared to the wealth she had known as a girl. The mansion that had hosted the wedding fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. Of the more than 200 people the Thorntons had enslaved, most scattered after emancipation, seeking family members from whom they had been separated, building new lives in freedom, carrying with them memories of bondage and stories of those who had resisted. Ella, the woman whose beating had triggered Micah's action, lived to see freedom. She remained in Tallahassee working as a laundress and raising a daughter she named Micah in honor of the man who had defended her. She told her daughter the story of that December night in 1864, of the young man who had refused to stand by while she was brutalized, who had paid for that refusal with his life. The story passed through generations, becoming part of a family's oral history, one of countless stories of resistance and sacrifice that African Americans preserved and passed down even when official histories ignored or distorted them. The historical record of Micah's execution is sparse. No newspaper account survives if one was ever written. No official documentation exists beyond the brief court records noting his trial and conviction. Even his full name has been lost to time, recorded in documents that have since disappeared or been destroyed. But the absence of extensive documentation does not mean his story lacks significance. Throughout the antebellum and Civil War period, enslaved people resisted in ways both large and small, their actions often going unrecorded by white authorities who preferred to maintain the fiction that enslaved people were content with their condition. The gaps in the historical record are themselves evidence of a system that sought to erase black humanity and black resistance from the official narrative of American history. What we know for certain is that Micah existed, that he struck Richard Thornton on the night of December 17, 1864, that he was tried and executed for that action, and that his death was one of thousands of executions carried out to maintain the system of slavery. But beyond these bare facts, his story represents something larger, the constant resistance that enslaved people mounted against their subjugation, the impossible choices that the system forced them to make, the human cost of maintaining white supremacy through violence and terror. Every enslaved person faced variations of the dilemma that confronted Micah that December night: submit to violence and degradation, or resist and face consequences that extended beyond the individual to their entire community. That so many chose resistance, even knowing the cost, testifies to the indomitable human spirit, to the refusal to accept dehumanization, even in the face of overwhelming power. Micah's story did not end with his death on December 23, 1864. It lived on in the memories of those who knew him, in the oral traditions of the African American community in Tallahassee, in the lessons that parents taught children about the price of freedom and the meaning of courage. It became part of a larger narrative about resistance to slavery, about the men and women who refused to accept their subjugation, who fought back in whatever ways they could, who paid terrible prices, but who also helped to bring down a system that many believed would last forever. When we remember Micah today, we remember not just one man, but all those who resisted, all those who said no when submission seemed like the only option, all those whose names have been lost, but whose actions helped to build the freedom we now take for granted. The story of Micah of Tallahassee reminds us that the end of slavery did not come simply through legislative action or military victory. It came through the accumulated resistance of enslaved people themselves, the ones who escaped, who slowed their work, who preserved their dignity and humanity despite systematic efforts to destroy both, who struck back when pushed beyond endurance, and who ultimately proved that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched or powerful, can survive when those it oppresses refuse to accept their subjugation. Micah's individual act of resistance was one small thread in a much larger tapestry of black resistance to slavery, a tapestry woven from countless acts of courage and defiance, some recorded and remembered, most lost to history, but no less significant for their absence from the written record. As we reflect on this story more than 160 years after Micah's death, we are reminded of the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. The legal structure of slavery was destroyed by the 13th Amendment, but the ideology of white supremacy that undergirded it survived and adapted, finding new forms in Jim Crow segregation, in mass incarceration, in persistent racial inequalities that continue to mark American society. Understanding this history, understanding the violence and terror that were required to maintain slavery, understanding the constant resistance that enslaved people mounted against their subjugation, is essential to understanding the present. Micah's story is not just history, it is a reminder of what human beings are capable of enduring and what they are capable of resisting. It is a testament to the power of individual action even in the face of systemic oppression. And it is a call to continue the work of creating a society where human dignity is truly universal, where the color of one's skin does not determine one's access to justice, safety, and opportunity. In the end, Micah of Tallahassee was a young man who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. He witnessed violence and refused to stand by. He acted according to his conscience, knowing it would cost him everything. And in doing so, he joined the long tradition of those who have resisted oppression throughout human history. Those who have said that some things matter more than survival, that human dignity cannot be compromised indefinitely, that there comes a moment when submission becomes more unbearable than resistance despite its costs. His story deserves to be remembered not because he was unique, but because he was representative, one of many who fought against slavery in their own ways, who refused to accept the role that the system demanded they play, and who helped through their resistance to bring about the freedom that eventually came to all enslaved people in America.